And then tonight's program is our very own member, John Sillito, and to introduce John is Greg Thompson.
Great to be here with you, and as Sandra was saying, bring everybody in your neighborhood for the next meeting so we'll meet our requirements for paying for the evening. We're absolutely working hard to reestablish ourselves from our pandemic-19 experience. I'm hoping everybody read Steve Berlin's wonderful newsletter for this meeting, and in that newsletter specifically read about our speaker for this evening. Am I doing this okay? John Sillito, because I assume most of you know John Sillito. John has been a member of Westerners since, I believe, 2011, John, is that right? And John is just a wonderful historian member for this group and has been a real contributor. We thank you for that, John. I would like to just assume you've read the background, and I want to talk about John Sillito as a historian, a librarian, an archivist, an instructor, an author, an editor who loves both history and politics, as well as minor and major league baseball, jazz music, and good and strong literature as defined and exemplified by the writings of the Beats for the period of 1940 to 1990. He is deeply dipped into the history of these topics that I mentioned, and the study of those areas. And if you add his work on Utah religious movements, you see the broad sweep of the research, teaching, and writing that John Sillito represents. From my perspective, John has had and continues to have 4 major careers during his 50-plus years in academics. All 4 of these careers were simultaneously developed during his time as both librarian and instructor. And he continues to build upon the 4 careers. His first was started when he entered the Weber State University Stewart Library Special Collections as a staff member, and carried with him during that tenure professor of librarian and university archivist. He did so in 1977, and that period in his career lasted through 2010, when he retired as a full emeritus faculty member in status. In that time, he and his colleagues in special collections developed an amazing special collections department. The special collections is known throughout the archival world for its richness, its accessibility, and its support of researchers, students, and the public at large. His career, his second career, as professor of history, paralleled and accompanied his time as librarian and archivist. He became an adjunct member of history in the Department of History at Weber State. And he taught, I suspect, virtually every term during that period that we were referring to earlier. Now, there are some of you in this audience that teach. To have a full-time job and teach on top of that is an amazing feat. After retiring from the library, as we mentioned, in 2010, his history career expanded. He spent 8 years teaching half-time for the history department in American history, and really had quite a career as a history instructor. He retired from his teaching career in 2018 into full-time retirement. Now, for most people, full-time retirement is a plan of moving away and traveling and resting a bit. Not for John Sillito. John Sillito only, upon retiring, it gave him the ability to spend full time on the other two parts of careers that I am mentioning: historic research and writing nonfiction history and publishing it. In each of these career categories, John has won awards for his exceptional work in publications and for his contribution in expanding our knowledge of Utah history and political experiences. John's love and passion for the topics of the political left, labor unions, the IWW, Joe Hill, the Beats and their movement are almost always present in his presentations and his published works in one way or another, and they underscore much of that work. Tonight we are very pleased and privileged to have John presenting to us once again, and this time he will be speaking on the political side of Utah's experiences. His presentation this evening is entitled Peace, Freedom, and Abundances: the 1948 Progressive Party Campaign in Utah. It is taken from his recent publication in the Utah Historical Quarterly, somewhat titled as such, and is a wonderful presentation. We are in for a treat, my friends, and it's with my wonderful honor and appreciation I introduce John Sillito to you. John, the podium is yours.
Well, I want to thank my good friend and mentor, really. Can you hear me? Can I put it here in this holder here thing? This works? Okay, good. That work? Well, thanks, Greg. I appreciated the introduction. You read it exactly like I wrote it, and I was pleased by that. I wasn't sure exactly how to start when Greg was going on and on. I thought, well, first I was going to tell a story. When I was in the Army, they started every instruction class with a dirty joke. And I thought about all those jokes, and I thought, no, there's not a one of them I could get away with. But when I heard what Greg had to say, I was reminded of the story about J. Golden Kimball. He was sent down to southern Utah to preach a funeral sermon for some good brother. He'd passed on to his reward. And he listened to the first speaker. He said, and he listened to the second speaker, go on and on about this good brother. Finally, he turned to Bishop. He said, I must be confused. Who the hell died here anyway, And I feel a little bit like that. Who the hell died here anyway? But anyway, I do appreciate it. And Greg and I go back a long, long time. And it's been a hell of a ride, brother. Okay, let's talk about peace, freedom, and abundance, 1948 Progressive Party campaign in Utah. You know, most of us are familiar with the iconic election night photograph of Harry Truman, smiling broadly while holding up a copy of the Chicago Tribune, which proclaimed Dewey defeats Truman. Despite that photo, Truman himself had doubts about, another sign of old age, had doubts about the outcome of the election before the first votes were cast. In late October, Walter Trohan of that same paper reported that Truman was aware of the darkness of his prospects, that he realized he was engaged in a losing fight, and while resigned to defeat, was determined to go down fighting, hoping to help the Democrats capture the Senate and gain seats in the House. Kind of has a familiar ring, doesn't it, these days? And yet Truman prevailed, defeating not only Republican Tom Dewey, who was referred to as the little man on the top of the wedding cake, but two third-party candidates, segregationist states' rights candidate Strom Thurmond, yes, that's Strom Thurmond, and progressive nominee, former Vice President Henry Wallace. It was one of the most amazing presidential elections in American history. I don't remember it personally, though I was around a little bit for that, but I don't remember it personally. Tonight I want to talk about the election, especially in terms of the support for Wallace, a left candidate in the Beehive State. Beyond that, the 1948 campaign also represents the end of an era when Utah Democrats not only dominated in presidential elections, but largely held state, legislative, and federal offices as well. 1948, Truman carried Utah. It's the last time a Democrat has carried Utah, with the exception of Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Well, obviously, there's much more to this chapter than I can discuss. If you have some questions, I hope I can answer them. So let's talk about Wallace now. On December 29, 1947, Wallace announced that he would enter the coming presidential race as an independent. The decision was the culmination of a series of events that began when Wallace was denied renomination in 1944. Over the next 3 years, he became increasingly critical of the foreign and domestic policies of Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman. During that period, many encouraged him to run as a Democratic challenger to Truman, an internal party challenge. Others suggested he should take advantage of the independent route, which is what he eventually did. In his announcement, Wallace told the American people that a new political alignment was necessary, he said, because everywhere in the United States today I find confusion, uncertainty, and fear. Again, kind of familiar. The people do not ask, will there be another war, but when will the war come? They do not ask, will there be another depression, but when will the depression start? Wallace told his listeners that thousands of people over the United States had asked him to make the fight, and called on those who agreed with him to join what he labeled as the forces of peace, progress, and prosperity. He said that he had assembled a Gideon's army, small in number, powerful in conviction, ready for action, and concluded, we face the future unfettered by any principle but the general welfare. We owe no allegiance to any group that does not serve that welfare. By God's grace, he said, the people's peace will usher in the century of the common man. Not long after that, it became clear that Gideon's army would be led not only by Wallace, but Idaho Democratic Senator Glenn Taylor as his vice presidential nominee. And that's a whole other story. Somebody look into his life. At this point, support for Wallace's views and the Progressive Party that he created nationwide was at its highest point that in the entire campaign. And many liberals, though not all, but many liberals felt that Wallace represented a continuation of the New Deal policies of Roosevelt's, which they believed had been abandoned by Truman. What I'd like to do tonight is threefold. Talk about who were these Utah progressives, what did they advocate, and what did they accomplish. In my examination, I adhered to the view of Richard Hofstadter, who believed, in his words, political historians should, quote, try to tell what people thought they were doing in their political activity. That is, what they thought they were either conserving or reforming or constructing. At this point, a little background is in order. I first became aware of Wallace in a history class paper I did at South High School for my teacher, Garn Coombs. Later, this interest reappeared in a course taught by Frank Jonas at the University of Utah. Maybe some of you remember Jonas. Since then, as I've continued in my history career, I've come to believe that most of Utah's political and social movements were part of similar efforts nationally. What was going on around the country was also going on here in Utah. Clearly, this view animated the research that John McCormick and I did on Utah socialism, which culminated in our book, A History of Utah Radicalism. And as I've said in other situations, I became convinced that there's more to Utah than the Trek and those damn seagulls. Okay, first one. Who were the Utah progressives? Well, the immediate reaction in Utah to Wallace's decision to run was mixed. This was true nationally. Utah liberals were unsure of how to proceed. George F. Balloff, a name you might know, for example, thought Wallace was a great guy, but commented he wouldn't follow him into a third party because he did not want to lessen the liberal movement in the Democratic Party. Local Republicans professed glee at Wallace's decision to run as an independent. Republican State Chair Vernon Romney Sr., said the move enhanced an already assured Republican victory in Utah. Again, familiar, isn't it? At the same time, Democratic Chair Clinton Vernon told the press that while the former vice president had a following in Utah, he doubted that the Wallace movement would gain much support because, as he said, there are quite a few Democrats friendly to Wallace who will not endorse the third party movement. And they're already beginning to wonder about the wisdom of such an effort. From the very beginning, Wallace and this new party he had created were widely accused of being influenced by communists, partly because the Communist Party endorsed him, Wallace, and didn't field its own ticket, which typically off and on in the 20th century they did. As part of this, for example, the Deseret News ran a cartoon titled, "The Papers Are Full of What Happens to People Who Pick Up Hitchhikers." It pictured a buck-toothed Wallace in a jalopy labeled Henry's Third Party, saying, "Sure, hop in," to a long-haired figure that resembled a wolf and was identified as American communists. These guys didn't have the talent of Pat Bagley, did they? Similar images and sentiments would be featured in the Utah press over the coming months. Despite the views of the Republican and Democratic officials and this criticism in the press, there was, however, some early support for Wallace among University of Utah students, and we find that that was a key organizing place for this new movement. A guy named Roy Tremaine, who was a liberal political science senior, wrote in the Utah Daily Chronicle that Wallace's entry into the race was, in his words, the most significant political development of 1947. Tremaine suggested the formation of a Wallace for President club at the school, declaring, "I'm going to vote for Wallace because I think he has become the great standard bearer of the FDR brand of liberalism. To cast a vote for Wallace is the same as casting a vote for Roosevelt." And you can't understand what these folks thought they were trying to construct, as Hofstadter said, if you don't understand how important Franklin Roosevelt was to liberals nationwide, but to liberals in this state. As I say, the U campus would become a central part of the Wallace movement. Efforts to organize a campus Students for Wallace began toward the end of January and quickly became a formal organization. Now you need to know in those days, political parties could not formally exist at the University of Utah. If you were a student at the U, wanted to be involved in whatever party, you had to be involved downtown with that party. The temporary chair of the organizing effort was a woman that I've come to get to know as a friend. As far as I know, the only remaining student for Wallace, still living, and she became a key leader. Students for Wallace encouraged students to affiliate, saying, if you don't want to be an apple seller with a PhD, if you don't want to be a veteran of World War III, then you should be for Wallace. Over the course of the next few weeks, the group sponsored a campus poll of student political attitudes, distributed handbills on campus, held joint meetings with other campus political groups, and sponsored regional Wallace leaders. At the same time, the group was especially active there at the University of Utah, publishing a newsletter, I wish we had copies, selecting a delegate to attend the National Students for Wallace Convention in Chicago, and organizing public forums. Looking back, Adele Ernstrom, a New Yorker with strong Utah roots, recalls that the group was a mixture of native Utahns and outsiders and included Mormons and non-Mormons. And despite differences in political opinions within the university student body, and they were there, she said, I don't recall division or hostility from other students. And despite occasional condescension on the part of some older party officials, Ernstrom believes that the state party took the Students for Wallace seriously. Similarly, a man named Martin Tolchin, also a New Yorker, but lacking Mormon roots, recalled that when he arrived at the university, he soon discovered a group of left-wing Easterners, and that they all supported Wallace because President Truman seemed too establishment for us, and Thomas Dewey, the Republican, was out of the question. Tolchin argued that because of their various outreach activities, the organization of the U was the backbone of progressive forces at the university, much like Henry Wallace is the leader of American progressive forces in the country. Capturing the group's sentiments, he noted that young people everywhere are rallying around the Wallace banner of peace, abundance, and security. In working with Henry Wallace, we are fighting for those rights. Ours is the right to a future, and our future is the issues in the 1948 election. Well, the nucleus of the Utah Progressive Party in this early period also came from the local chapter of a group called the Progressive Citizens of America and a national liberal organization, and the executive board of the very, very left-wing International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, who endorsed Wallace's candidacy based on widespread support for Wallace among its membership. Again, the Roosevelt connection. The board said Wallace had inherited the mantle of Franklin Roosevelt, noting that they felt a strong allegiance to this humble champion of America's common man. Obviously, it's impossible to determine who voted for Wallace in Utah and exactly why they did. But by examining those most closely affiliated with the Progressive Party, officers, candidates, organizers, we get some sense of who they were. Utah Progressive were much more diverse and cosmopolitan than was the state itself. They were male and female, white, black, and Asian, old and young, with ages ranging from those in their late 60s to some, like Adele and Marty, in their teens. Among their ranks were parents and children, in-laws, siblings. They were single, married, and divorced. The campaign contributed to some of those marriages, some of those divorces, and even a few romances. Some were immigrants, others were first-generation Americans. But they all had, many had deep roots in Utah and the nation. In terms of religion, there were Mormons, ex-Mormons, Catholics, Jews, several Unitarians, and others not affiliated with any religious tradition. Most Utah progressives, because they had supported Roosevelt, had ties, roots in the Democratic Party, including some who'd held party or elected office. Moreover, they were closely tied to the trade union movement, especially the railroad and mining unions in the state. At the same time, despite that labor tie, many were white-collar workers, lawyers, social workers, ministers, clerks, salespeople, writers, professors, and obviously students. There were veterans ranging from service in the Spanish-American War to World War II. Some brought to the Wallace movement experiences from the radical and liberal movements of the 1930s. For others, the 1948 campaign represented their very first political activity. Were some of them communists or tied closely to the Communist Party? Clearly, some were. But many more were simply motivated by the issues of peace, abundance, ending discrimination against African Americans, and economic security. Reflecting on the charges of communist affiliation, I said to Adele, did that bother you when you were accused of being a commie? And she replied this way: the communists supported the New Deal, with which Wallace was, of course, associated. I think there was an understanding that red baiting was an attack on what the New Deal had stood for. In other words, she said, the Wallace candidacy represented a tradition that was coming under attack. Some progressives continued their activity in the years ahead, while for others, the Wallace campaign was their last real political involvement. Many were harassed because of their affiliation with Wallace, and some left the state as a result. Those I met who were involved in the progressive cause looked back on their efforts with pride and a sense that they had done what needed to be done. In that regard, they remind me of the veterans I have known of the civil rights, feminist, and anti-war movements of the 1960s. Second, what did they advocate? Well, Utah progressives held their founding convention on July 11th, where some, according to the press, 100 enthusiastic delegates officially disbanded the Utah Wallace for President Committee and replaced it with the Utah Progressive Party. Among them was the state chair, a guy named Gordon Hoxie, who became the party's best-known figure. Reflecting national progressive positions, the hall was decorated with signs reading, "Peace not war," "Schools not draft," "Jim Crow must go," and "Utah favors the 18-year-old voting age." The convention drafted a state platform and also adopted as the party symbol a flaming torch representing the liberty of the American people set against a background of the mountains. Among the torch were the words, above the torch were the words "peace, abundance, security." The keynote speaker of that convention was a former Washington representative, Hugh DeLacy, a real red, who told the delegates that the two old parties had become one because they took the same stand on all major questions. He further declared that the leaders of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, had jointly betrayed the promise of the just and lasting peace existing when Roosevelt was at the helm. The giant Wall Street-owned corporations are calling the tune to which both old parties are dancing. He summarized the goals of the new party as consisting of secure housing, adequate pensions of $100 a month, prepaid medical insurance, a plan for full civil liberties for our people, and peace. And Utah progressives agreed wholeheartedly with those sentiments. 10 days later, several of these Utah progressives, including Hoxie and a woman named Jessie Greenhall, attended the National Progressive Party Convention, which was held in Philadelphia. The Republicans, the Democrats, and the progressives all met in Philadelphia. At this meeting, the ranks of Gideon's Army officially nominated Wallace and Taylor and ratified a platform that was one of the most far-reaching in U.S. political history. Among other things, it called for peace with the Soviet Union, based on a peaceful, hopeful negotiation, repealing the draft, supporting the United Nations, and in domestic policy, it called for an end to discrimination in all forms, against all people, regardless, gender, sexual orientation, color, race, whatever. National health insurance, equal pay for equal work, support for the Equal Rights Amendment. Boy, they were ahead of their time. Making Election Day a national holiday, and an old age pension of $100 a month to all over age 60, based on right, not on pauperizing need. $100 a month seemed to be the amount everybody agreed on. And Utah progressives agreed with those sentiments. They came back from Philadelphia, fired up and ready to go. There were some interesting delegates at that Progressive Party convention. There was a young black woman named Coretta Scott at that convention. You may know her more as Coretta Scott King. There was a young South Dakota veteran of World War II at that convention named George McGovern. And there were other people there who honestly believed this was the moment in American history when World War III could be prevented. And they were willing to put their bodies, but also their futures on the line. Well, between the nominating convention and the election, the Utah Progressives waged a vigorous campaign that frankly was largely ignored. The party was hindered by a lack of interest from potential supporters. Okay. But more importantly, from a lack of money. Hoxie recalled, "We were, for all intents and purposes, completely broke. We couldn't count on much help from the National Party headquarters because they were in as bad a financial shape as we were. Because of the lack of money, we were unable to wage the kind of campaign a new party must wage if it intends to be a lasting party. Our lack of funds made it impossible to buy newspaper space, run radio spots on local stations." He said this was what caused the low vote for Wallace in Utah. Third, what did they accomplish? Well, on Tuesday, November 2nd, Wallace ran a distant fourth nationally, garnering some 2% of the national vote. Utah voters supported Harry Truman for president by a vote of 149,000, 54% of the popular vote, to Thomas Dewey, the Republicans, 125, 45%. Wallace polled 2,679 votes, resulting in approximately the 1% the polls of the Times locally had predicted. 4 counties provided more than 80% of the total progressive vote. Salt Lake, where he received 1,400, and Utah, Weber, and Carbon were the other 3. Well, Progressive Party leaders put the best face on the results that they could. Hoxie issued a press release appealing for support, emphasizing that the party in Utah would continue its fight for the vital issues. It's based on fundamental values and will continue to exist regardless of the decisions of the election. A woman who I wished I'd met, who was really a spark plug in that party, named Arvilla Greatorex, who was the Progressive Party's state secretary, released a statement saying, "We are firmly convinced that the campaign carried on by the Progressive Party around the vital issues of peace, housing, high prices, repeal of Taft-Hartley, and civil rights had a profound effect on the nation." She indicated that when Truman began to campaign on these issues, when he finally realized that the people really wanted a return to Roosevelt ideas and policies, the campaign changed. Well, what else could they say? What else could they say? At the same time, reflecting that burning fervor of those young progressives, a young man named Dick Lehman, who was one of them, said, "With Wallace's defeat, our last chance for peace has disappeared as the Progressive Party saw its predicted strength dissipate in a cloud of electoral smoke." They could turn a phrase. They could turn a phrase. Well, more than a half a century ago, for that poli-sci class at the U, I interviewed several of the Utah Progressive Party leaders, all since long deceased, who reflected on those times and the challenges facing their efforts. Jesse Greenhall, who was the party's vice chair, blamed the progressive failure on the biased press, which she said created an inaccurate and unfavorable image of Wallace. For her part, Edna Squires, another older person but totally dedicated, a leader of what was called the Women for Wallace, ascribed the defeat to the charges of communist influence and, quote, said the party was red-baited out of existence. The indefatigable party chair, Gordon Hoxie, agreed with these assessments. I remember well sitting in his office in South Salt Lake and having him tell me that the most important reason why the Progressive Party lost so badly was that people just did not want to waste their vote. When it came down to the final showdown in the voting booths, many people who really favored Wallace, he said, voted for Truman. Those people were afraid of Thomas Dewey, and they chose Truman, he said, as the lesser of 2 evils. When you come right down to it, Hoxie told me, a person hates to waste his vote on a sure loser. Besides, during the last few weeks of the campaign, a shift on the part of Truman made many progressive-leaning voters more amenable to supporting him. There is no question, he said to me, that the progressive vote in 1948 in Utah was nowhere near the actual number of people who preferred Wallace to either of the major party candidates. Well, when I began the revision of my initial work, as I noted, I found 2 individuals still living who added their recollections to what I already knew and really made it possible for me to finish the article. For Martin Tolkien, who became a very important political journalist, founded the Hill paper and Politico, and told me when I asked him why he was attracted to the Progressive Party, he said, "I thought it was a pretty good place to find girls." Sadly, Martin passed away in February, but he told me the progressives were good people whose heart was in the right place. And as Adele Ernstrom, as I've mentioned, who went on to a very distinguished career as an art historian, observes, it was a brave effort at the beginning of what would be a very dark time. In many ways, these assessments, all of them, are accurate. A combination of the media's ability to paint Wallace as a crackpot, the incessant red baiting, the aversion to casting a wasted vote, were at the heart of the rejection of the Progressive Party by Utah voters, and nationally as well. Still, at the midpoint of the 20th century, nearly 3,000 Utahns looked at the most important issues facing this country: war, economic insecurity, racial justice, and they cast their ballot for Wallace and Taylor and the Progressive Banner. In the face of likely disapproval from some around them by standing up for what they believed. Adele's aunt thought she was a commie. Despite that, these Utahns demonstrated they were willing to challenge prevailing political views. Having lived through a world war and not wanting to fight another one, they deeply feared the possibility of an American fascism. In that regard, I think their attitudes and actions provide a valuable statement in a difficult and contentious post-war world. And if Hoxie is correct, more Utahns agreed with this view than voted for it. Indeed, to repeat, Utah progressives believed in Hofstadter's view that they sought to construct a different world in the shadow of nuclear war, one that was committed to peace, economic security, and racial justice. More research needs to be done on the Utah left after the Wallace campaign. Were there any possible connections between them and later Utah radical impulses, including in the 60s? I don't know. I'm doing a little looking. Still, the little-known story of this coalition of Utah liberals, labor, and the left is worth remembering as we seek to comprehend the larger narrative of this state's political history. Thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to have a drink of water, and then if you have questions or comments, I'll do my best. Or if you say, no, I'd really rather go home, that's okay too. Please.
How many votes did Strom Thurmond's party get in the 48 election?
Yeah, interesting. He ran third and carried some states and got some electoral votes.
But how many in Utah?
Oh, and he was not on the ballot in Utah. He was not on the ballot in Utah. But he ran third nationally. And what you found was Truman had his left wing deserting him and his right wing deserting him. And he just said, I'm just going to go straight ahead.
So who finished third?
Who finished third? Thurmond. In nationally?
No, in Utah.
Wallace.
Wallace finished third.
Yeah. I said to my dad, so who'd you vote for in 1948? He said, Truman. I said, you should have voted for Wallace. Well, maybe, he said, but I got so damn tired of people telling me that little guy couldn't win. I'll show him, he said. I'll show him that he can win. A few years later, I said to him, who'd you vote for, Nixon or McGovern? He looked at me and said, McGovern. Good choice, Dad. Good choice. Other questions or comments? Connie.
Wallace campaign in Utah?
He did not. He did not. They tried to bring him, some of the students for Wallace tried to bring him right after he announced. And he was on his way here, and then there was a major vote on the draft in Washington. And he canceled his trip to Utah, went back to D.C. to participate in the hearings on that vote, never got back. Taylor came often to Utah. He had come to Utah a couple of times before this when he was just senator from Idaho. And he came a couple of times during the campaign. And if you don't know anything about Glenn Taylor, you should look him up. He styled himself the singing cowboy senator, and he was elected kind of as a fluke in 1944 in Idaho. And he admitted it was the best job he'd ever had. He'd worked as a sheet metal worker, and he worked all kinds of things. But he and his wife, Dora, had a traveling theatrical company. And they were frequently in Utah putting on these little shows. When he told Dora he was going to run for vice president, she said, you guys will lose, and there goes the best job you ever had. And that's exactly what happened. They did lose. He lost. He ran 3 or 4 times after that. Finally, he moved to California because he invented something that became a hugely popular item. I wished I could find one. It was called the Taylor Topper. It was one of the earliest toupees. And he figured out how to make it out of sheet metal, because he was a sheet metal worker. And he put human hair in it, he put it on. And somebody said, why did you do that? He said, I got tired when I would go to a motel with Dora and they would say, and what is your lovely daughter's name? Okay, he said. So he did it. And he became really wealthy and very, very middle class. Other things, comments, questions? Please do.
Why did Wallace not see the Soviet Union as a threat like Eisenhower and Truman?
Yeah, that's a good question that requires a lot more time than we have. In essence, Wallace honestly believed that what Roosevelt said about the United Nations was the way the world needed to go, that you really could trust the Russians. He was probably naive, and he later admitted he was naive. It wasn't just the Students for Wallace that had a certain amount of chutzpah, so did I. When I was doing my paper at South High, I thought, well, I should write Henry Wallace and ask him how come this all happened. So of course I did, and of course he answered. It was all of 16 or something, full of myself, then and now. But he later broke with the Progressive Party. When the United States got involved in the war in Korea, he said, when my government and the United Nations sanctions this action, I have to support my government and the United Nations. He, prior to becoming vice president, he was Secretary of Agriculture. And I interviewed Ezra Taft Benson, maybe you know the name, when I started doing my research on Wallace. And he said to me, you know, Henry Wallace came to me and told me I was the best Secretary of Agriculture they'd ever had, much better than he was, than Wallace was, and everything I was doing is exactly what he would do now. I don't know, but that's what he told me. Other comments? Craig.
Yes, why wasn't Wallace included on Roosevelt's last ticket?
That's another interesting question. Why did they dump Wallace in 44? The short answer is everybody knew Wallace, Wallace Truman. Everybody knew Roosevelt was not going to survive a fourth term. Everybody in the Democratic Party knew he would not survive. And they said, we cannot allow this fuzzy, idealistic, liberal guy to be the next president of the United States. And so they got together and convinced Roosevelt that he had to choose somebody else. And Roosevelt really preferred Wallace to the other candidates. And finally, the Democratic Party chair from Missouri, a guy named Bob Hannigan, engineered a deal where Roosevelt sent a telegram to the convention that said, if I were a delegate, I would vote for Henry Wallace, but I don't in any way want to dictate my feelings to the convention. Well, in 1940, 4 years before, he told the delegates if they didn't nominate Wallace, he wouldn't accept the presidential nomination. So he was not above dictating. Hannigan said to him, well, who would you really prefer? And he said, well, I would prefer William O. Douglas, or James Burns or William O. Douglas. Okay, he said, I'll get a letter that goes out. You've asked me. He reversed the order and said, I would prefer either Harry Truman or William O. Douglas. And so they were engineering this. And Hannigan said, on my tombstone, is what my epitaph will read. This is the man who kept Henry Wallace from becoming president of the United States. They feared his very, very liberal views and his very pro-Russian belief that Russia was somebody you could work with. And that was it. And if you see the pictures of Wallace standing there when Truman is sworn in as president, you don't need captions to know what was going through his head. This could have been me. And this haberdasher from Kansas City, I don't think so. Yeah, Barbara.
Do you think Wallace would have dropped the bomb?
That's a good question, too. He waffled on that a little bit. And he would talk about it was a wartime necessity, but now that it's been done, we need to make sure it's never done again. And we need to take it out of the hands of both the United States and the Soviet Union and put it under the control of the United Nations. Would he have dropped it in 1945? I don't know. It's a hell of a question, though. He was so against fascism. He may well have been convinced. Yeah.
Well, almost every Western country adopted universal health care after World War II.
Right.
And Wallace was in favor of that. Would he have had the political support in Congress to have gotten that through if he would have been president?
No.
Really?
Yeah. That would have assumed he would be president and elected a whole bunch of members of Congress and Senate and House. And it wouldn't have happened. So he probably couldn't get that through. But, well, I don't know. Maybe he could have. I don't think he could have. But these issues, and we're dealing with them big time right now. And I don't want to get political here, but we're dealing with them, and we've been dealing with them for a while. And as you say, other countries did it. You know, they moved that way. What would the world have looked like if we hadn't spent all those millions of dollars on the Cold War and armaments and stuff like that? Who knows? I don't know. It could have been worse. Other comments, questions? Well, thanks again for your kind attention.